What are the 4 species of Sukkoth? In Leviticus 23:40, we are commanded that on the first day of Sukkoth, we are to take 4 different things. But what are these 4 things that we are taking? In looking at this issue, I want to talk about some issues related to translating it, and then we will look at a literal translation of Leviticus 23:40, and then talk about each of the individual species and elaborate upon that. So first, in regard to translation issues. Now, obviously, translating something is not as simple as just opening up a dictionary and seeing what the official translation for a given word is. Obviously, these dictionaries, they had to get their information from somewhere. They're not the ultimate authority on it. And just like with any translation, just like with a translation of the Torah or of the Bible, there is no perfect translation. And the same thing takes place with dictionaries. There is no perfect dictionary. And so one primary thing we might rely on in translating a word is looking at how that word is used across a variety of contexts. Some words we can very easily do this with in the Torah because they are used very frequently, and they're used in a number of different contexts. And even better, if they have related words that are basically used as verbs and nouns, and they may have related forms that are obviously from the same word. Looking at how all of those examples are used in a variety of contexts can give us a pretty good idea as to the meaning of many words. This is not typically the case when dealing with something very specific, like a species of animal or a species of tree or plant, like we're dealing with here. Even if a word for a specific tree is used repeatedly, that alone may not tell us anything. We may be able to determine that it is a tree, but beyond that, we may not know any specific details about that. We don't have books on botany in ancient Hebrew that explain to us all of the descriptions of these individual trees and of these categories that they used in their language. So this presents kind of a problem for us, because in looking at translating things like the types of animals in Leviticus 11, or in translating the 4 species of Leviticus 23:40, we have to work with what we have otherwise. So one thing we might do is look at uses of the word in other languages, uses of cognates. So we might find in another language a word that is very similar or basically identical to a given Hebrew word. And so if we look at how they used that word, we might be able to infer something from that. Now, is this a perfect solution? No, it is not perfect, but we are working with what we have. Something else that we might do is look at how people translated those words into another language. Obviously, this is going to be most useful in the case that people were still speaking ancient Hebrew at that time. If they still knew ancient Hebrew at that time, and they were translating it based off of that knowledge, there's a much higher probability that the translation is going to be legitimate, that it's going to be based upon actual knowledge of the language. And one resource that we have that I think is sometimes underutilized is the Septuagint. It was translated into Greek. The Torah was translated into Greek while they were still speaking ancient Hebrew or biblical Hebrew at that time. So is this a perfect solution, though? No. It is not a perfect translation, and it is not a perfect solution to this. But we're working with what we have. So this is one resource we might look to in translating something like Leviticus 23:40. So we do have some issues with translating this verse. But in working with the resources that we have, I think we can come to a pretty decent idea of what these 4 species are. So first, let's look at a very literal translation of Leviticus 23:40. And you shall take to you in the first day fruit of tree of honor, palms of palm trees, branch of entwined tree, and mixtures of watercourse, and you shall brighten before Yahuwah your Elohim 7 days. So we have our 4 different things that we are to take. We are to take fruit of tree of honor, palms of palm trees, branch of entwined tree, and mixtures of watercourse. First, with fruit of tree of honor. The first thing is we are told to take the fruit. It literally says fruit here, and it says this based upon all of the early translations of it as well. It says it in the Hebrew, it says it in the other translations of the Hebrew that were made early on. But we wouldn't know this based upon how it's rendered in the King James or in some other English translations, but that is indeed what it says. It says fruit. So we are taking the fruit of a tree of honor. What is this tree of honor? We don't actually see examples of this phrase in the Torah or in the Tanakh that really give us any indication of what it's talking about. The word used for honor is used pretty consistently for honor, and that's about the best that I think we can arrive at with that word. So what is a tree of honor? In working with what we have, in looking at how this word was translated, the other early translations of the Torah, there is also a connotation of honor or beauty or adornment, but specifically in reference to trees, there is a connotation of being seasonal. If we treated this as fruit of tree of season, it would make sense with this context, because obviously if a tree has fruit on it, it's going to be a seasonal tree. So what I arrived at for this is fruit of tree of season. Seasonal fruit from a tree. Next we have palms of palm trees. The first palms in this is actually the palm of the hand. And then we have palm trees, which obviously referring to the tree. And the first palm would be referring to the palm as in the branch with the leaves on it, the fronds or the palm duster. So we have palms of palm trees. Next we have branch of entwined tree. This is a word that we do see used at times in the Torah and also in the Tanakh. It is used a couple of times in reference to a tree, but most typically it is used in reference to rope or things that are entwined. Just working with these words alone, we might have a hypothesis that, well, maybe it's referring to the branches and the leaves being intertwined. Maybe there are a lot of branches and they are all woven together, or maybe it's a very bushy plant, or something along those lines. In looking into how this verse was translated with the early translations, those that were done while people were still speaking the language, this word for entwined was treated as shaggy or leafy. So we would have branch of an entwined tree, with entwined being treated as something that is shaggy, something is leafy, something is bushy. And this seems to make sense working with the Hebrew wording. So we have branch of bushy tree for this one. And finally we have mixtures of watercourse. Based upon the Hebrew alone, it's not obvious what tree this is referring to, or if it's referring to a tree at all for that matter. We can see it has something to do with the watercourse, but it's not clear what these mixtures are based upon that alone. In working with what we have, as we've been doing, this has been consistently treated as referring to the willow. This is how it was understood in those early translations. And as with any of these, when we are looking to a translation of this, we need to see if that actually seems to line up with what the Hebrew says, if that seems to match what's going on in the Hebrew, not just taking the other language on face value. And in this case, we have this reference to the watercourse. And apparently, willows were commonly planted along watercourses to prevent erosion. So this could be what it is referring to. So based upon this research, we have these 4 different things that we are gathering. We are taking on the first day. Fruit of tree of season. So we have seasonal fruit. Palms of palm trees. So we have branches off of the palm. Branch of bushy tree. So we're dealing with trees that are bushy or that are leafy. And willows of watercourse. So we have willows. And since this research involved issues of different languages, issues of early translations of the Torah, I want to emphasize that what is important is what the Hebrew of the manuscript says, is what it actually says in the written Torah, in the manuscripts that we're working with. And we can look at things like what goes on in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 8, for example. They talk about Sukkoth in that passage and talk about observing it. And even though they're referring to what it says in the Torah, supposedly, the wording there is very different. It's not the same that we see in Leviticus 23:40. And the way that the passage appears, the way that the wording appears in Leviticus 23:40 is pretty consistent based upon the other manuscripts that we have access to my knowledge, based upon the Dead Sea Scrolls and based upon other manuscripts, including the Samaritan manuscripts. The only real difference is just difference in spelling, nothing of any real substance. So what is important here is that we are looking to what the written Torah says. And even though we may be using other languages, or we may be using things like the later books of the Tanakh to help us understand what the Torah is saying, we have to return to the passages in the written Torah as our guide for what we are to do. We have to rely upon that. Now, otherwise, in understanding it, we have to work with what we have. But we have to remember that what is important is what the written Torah says. So here are these 4 species, once again. Fruit of tree of season, palms of palm trees, branch of bushy tree, and willows of watercourse. We will be taking these on the first day of Sukkoth, on the 15th day of the 7th month. Thanks for watching. Feel free to check out some of my other videos on other Torah issues, and be sure that you stay in touch so we can continue this discussion. Thanks for watching. Remember the commands. Shalom.